All right. So last week we talked about Paul's prayer for the Philippians, and we looked at chapter 1, verses 3 through 11, and we saw that Paul was thankful for each of the Philippian believers and said that we should probably follow his example, and that then he gives them the content of his prayer for them, that their love for one another would overflow more and more with knowledge and full insight, and that the whole purpose of this is that they would be pure and blameless so that they can produce this harvest of righteousness when it's the day of Jesus. And we said all of this is like this metaphor I used of the boat, that you have to be on the boat of Jesus' salvation, that he is taking you from the beginning of your walk with him all the way to the end, and that if you think you can rely on anything except for him, then you are definitely going to be lost as surely as if you were a drowning person rescued by a boat. And so now we come tonight to Paul's difficulties that he is facing, and we will see that Paul has some instructions for the Philippians in the midst of all this difficulty, that he is in a really tough spot himself, and he knows that they are as well. So he wants to encourage them by helping them see what his life is currently like and help them to understand that they can also have a different perspective. So if somebody could start off for us reading chapter 1, verses 12 through 14.
I want you to know, brothers, that what has happened to me has really served to advance the gospel, so that it has become known throughout the whole imperial guard and to all the rest that my imprisonment is for Christ. And most of the brothers, having become confident in the Lord by my imprisonment, are much more bold to speak the word without fear.
All right, that's all. Thank you. So Paul there in verse 12 says something amazing to me, that he says, I want you to know that what's happened to me has actually helped to spread the gospel. And to me, that opening statement says that Paul has a perspective that's very different than would naturally be your perspective, right? If you're in a Roman prison, if you are in the position that he's in, you're not naturally going to be thinking about anything except yourself, right? If you are in his position, all you're going to care about without the Spirit being involved is your personal pain, your personal difficulty, everything that you have gone through. But he says, this has helped to spread the gospel. Now, all mature Christians, we understand that our suffering has a purpose, right? If you understand anything about the Bible, if you've read through it at all, you see again and again that God shows that when you have troubles, that isn't pointless. He is always going to use that for something to benefit his kingdom, and usually use it to benefit you in one way or another. But it's a very different experience for you to recognize that while you're in the midst of the suffering, right? Most of us, we can only see it when we get out to the other side. When you have that horrible diagnosis, when you have the sudden expense, when you have all of the troubles in life, usually all you can see is the thing in front of you. All you can see is that pain and difficulty, and you just get stuck on that. You keep worrying about it, you keep thinking about it, you keep wondering, how could this possibly be used for the glory? And yet Paul has a kind of unique gift here, where he's in the middle of it. He is right in the midst of the suffering, and he also has the perspective where he can say, I can see what this is doing for God right now. I'm in the pain, and I can already see that this is accomplishing amazing things. Now, it's very easy, even from the outside, while it's going on, for me to see in our church some of the people who are suffering, and I can see how God is using their suffering for amazing things. It may not immediately encourage them if I go to tell them that, but if I see some of these people who are in chronic health conditions, who are in desperate situations with their finances, who have all of these difficulties, I can say, wow, look at how God is doing things, how he's encouraging people, how he's building up his church, because that's happening in your life, and you're remaining faithful. Yet it is very unusual for you to be able to see that while you're in the prison cell, right? While you're in this position, in the midst of the pain, when life is so unfair and so hard. God was very gracious to Paul, and so he lets him see the benefit of his pain. It's very important that we encourage suffering Christians in that position, right? If you can see some benefit for those people, if you can say, I see that God is really encouraging this person by how you're going through this, by what you're doing, I think it's a beneficial thing for you to go to them and say, hey, God is using this. Right now, God's doing something special in the midst of your suffering. And if you don't see the value in that, pray to God and ask him to show you the perspective. because they are probably going to be too consumed with the burden to be able to see it themselves. So if you ask the Lord, he will certainly show you something that you could encourage them with. Paul's suffering is almost entirely caused by Rome right now. In the natural world, almost everything that he is going through is because of the Roman government. And the Roman government under Nero at this point is really beginning to ramp up the persecution. In a couple of years, we will see that this man is going to kind of lose his mind, and that Roman historians and most of the populace thought that he started the fire that consumed his city himself. But he is going to blame the Christians for it and say, these people are the problem. They have caused all of the difficulty. Much like Hitler with the Jews, Nero is really going to ramp up persecution on the basis of a lie. And he is going to say, this is what these people are really like. And so Paul here is about 2 years before Nero completely loses his mind, but he's already started some of this serious persecution. He's already put Christians into jail. He's already trying to shut the message down, and he's doing whatever he can to stop the spread of the gospel. Now, before Nero and before most of the ramp up, almost all of the persecution that had happened was within the Jewish community, right? When you look at the early church in the book of Acts, almost everything bad that happens to the early church happens because of the Jews and their opposition to the message of Jesus. But now it has switched over to the Romans. And so this government that is across the whole empire, as we've talked about, Philippi is right in the middle of this important road in Rome. And now Rome opposes all the spread of Christianity. So what is the government trying to accomplish by persecuting Christians? Yeah. They want to keep things in order. They want to stop the spread, but why? Why do they have such an issue with Christianity, do you think?
I mean, they had their own pantheon of gods.
Yeah.
Their own ideas and beliefs.
Yeah, because it's a direct threat to the entire system of the Roman imperial system. The Roman Empire, once it has become an empire under Julius Caesar and Caesar Augustus, you get this declaration that the emperor is God, that they are God on earth. They are Lord. And so what we have here is exactly the problem that the Jews bring up with Jesus, where they say, wait a minute, this guy is saying he is Lord. So what are we going to do here? And when they have this decision to make of who is going to be the ruler, the Romans have no choice, right? From their perspective, the only option is to shut down any other claim. Anybody who shows up and says, I am in control, has to be shut down. Because any threat like this in an empire this large, this spread out, with this much difficulty in getting your troops where you needed them to be, you have to have total control. So when you have these people coming around saying, no, Jesus Christ is Lord, it's a direct threat to everything that Rome thinks should be. But what actually happens? What is it that happens once they start putting Christians into jail, once they start trying to harm Christianity? What happens instead? Yeah, Paul's just told us the gospel has spread more because of persecution. Now, that must have been a confounding experience if you were a Roman governor. If you were somebody who was in charge, if you picture today that our Congress is going to make a law and they're going to say, we're going to stop this radical ideology. And what we're going to do is we're going to imprison everybody who has this radical belief system. And everybody that you put into jail seems to increase the spread of the ideology. God is using suffering to spread his gospel. There's nothing that so clearly testifies to our true belief, than our willingness to suffer for it, right? When somebody is willing to suffer for their beliefs, it makes you kind of raise your eyebrow, right? It makes you go, well, why would they do that? What is it about that belief that's so important to them that they would go through that? In Acts 11:19, we see that Stephen has just been killed, and it says, now those who had been scattered by the persecution that broke out when Stephen was killed traveled as far as Phoenicia, Cyprus, and Antioch, spreading the word only among Jews. So these Jewish Christians, right there at the beginning, Paul is supporting the death of Stephen, one of the effective preachers in the early church. They kill this man in trying to stop him from spreading the gospel. And immediately what happens is the whole church scatters. all over the eastern half of the empire, and they start planting more and more and more churches. So this effort to try to destroy the church in Jerusalem spreads it all over the empire. The effort that these people make completely gets ruined. A radical Muslim is willing to kill you for their faith. We are all familiar with Muslim terrorism, but a true Christian is willing to let you kill them for their faith. Now that's a very difficult thing, right? The math problem doesn't seem like it should work for the Muslims or for the Romans. They want to kill you for their beliefs, and you are willing to die for your beliefs. Just by simple math, one kills you, so there's one less Christian. And it seems as if there should be less Christians in the world, right? Every radical Muslim that kills a true Christian, we should now have more Muslims. But if you look in those places, just like in ancient Rome, every time that happens, Christianity starts to bubble up. Every time somebody attacks the church and really thinks they're going to smash it down and say the gospel of Jesus is going to be violently suppressed, the church bubbles up. And it starts spreading all over the place, and it gets more and more passionate, and it gets more and more strength. If one group is willing to kill and the other is willing to die, you would expect the one who's willing to die to go away. But in fact, that's not how it ever works. Persecution intensifies faith. It forces you to immediately choose, right? This world or the next. It's no longer going to be a question where you can kick the can down the road and say, well, maybe I'll decide for Jesus in a few years. Maybe I'll just get a little bit more of the rowdy living out, and then I'll think about committing my life for real. When somebody shows up and they say, hey, I heard your family believes in Jesus, you decide right then, am I going to say yes or no? Which way am I going to go? These consequences are right at my doorstep, and it's going to be this moment that I have to decide. And so true Christian zeal is fanned into flame by the Spirit. It's as if these people see a fire, and as they go in to put it out, they grab the first liquid they can get a hold of, and they find out that they have gasoline instead of water. They're pouring this on, and they're pouring it on, and they're doing it over and over again. And every time they douse it, it just keeps getting bigger. And it just keeps going further and further into this blaze. Paul then gives us some specifics about the gospel spread. He first said that the truth of Jesus is seeping into the imperial guard. And in verse 13 there, we have some good evidence that Philippians is probably written from the city of Rome, because the Greek says that it has become known throughout the whole praetorium. Now, the other cities had members of this imperial guard, but saying the whole guard only makes sense if it's a decent number of people, right? If I say the whole church and there's 3 people, you guys are going to kind of think I'm crazy. But if I say the whole guard and there's a very large group of people, we're dealing with a specific place, and that's only in Rome. At this point in Roman history, the Praetorian Guard was very important. Now, we're clearly not talking about Disney's effort to rebrand the Praetorian Guard as some form of Star Wars soldiers that we have in some of these recent movies. We're dealing with these guys over here on the left, the elite of the Roman army. Now, Caesar Augustus had made this his private security force. He took some of the best veterans of the Roman army and said, you guys are going to be my bodyguards. You're going to do exactly what I tell you to do. And by the time of Nero, they are decked out in gold. They're running around making sure that they are always known, and they get paid about 3 times the amount of a typical soldier. So these were highly desired positions. They were an elite force that was designed to deal with very important problems. If anybody shows up to Rome and they want to do anything to the emperor, these are the guys that are supposed to deal with it. Now, a couple of years after the book of Philippians, once Nero has this huge fire go through his hometown of Rome, he builds this palace for himself, the House of Gold. Now, if you take a look at that, it's pretty snazzy even by modern standards. He has what would probably be considered a small lake out in front of it with a weird little island in the midst of it. He has somewhere around 9,000 Praetorian guards that are stationed right beside this palace because he's a very paranoid man and he wants to make sure that nobody can get to him. So he is going to make sure that everybody knows his hand-picked guards are right there beside him in this very large palace. Now, at the time of Paul's writing in Philippians, his home isn't any smaller than this. It's just a little less focused on gold. And Paul tells us that his message is spreading far and wide. Now, I've just told you, Nero has around 9,000 Praetorian guards. And Paul tells us in verse 13, it has become known through the whole guard that what has happened to me is for Jesus. That's pretty amazing, right? These people have put him in prison to shut him up about Jesus. Now, as we said a couple of weeks ago, in the Roman system of prisons, you were chained to a Roman soldier at all times. Roughly 4-hour shifts, historians think. Every 4 hours, a new soldier. So you've got 6 soldiers a day that are coming in there, and they're going through this rotation. We don't know how often they would have been totally new people. But you can't imagine what that must have been like for Paul, right? Can you just think about the opportunity that God has given this man, right? If you picture Dan Kilo, as we were talking about him in the grocery store, if every 4 hours we gave him a brand new person who had never heard about Jesus, and we were going to chain them together and say, you can't get away from Dan for 4 hours. And just to let you know, in the Roman system of justice, they couldn't hit him because he's a Roman citizen. So even if they got really tired of Dan, they are not legally allowed to do anything about it. They just have to stand there and listen. So man, what an opportunity that God has given to this wonderful apostle, where he is right in the middle of the emperor's household. And God says, you're going to have 6 of these 9,000 guys every day. They're going to come in. And maybe it's the same 6 guys. We don't know. But they're probably talking about this. They're probably going back to the barracks and they're saying, you won't believe what's over there. This guy is in there and he just keeps telling us that there's some guy who got crucified all the way over there in Palestine. And he says that that's the Lord of all creation. And so it just keeps spreading and spreading and spreading because people hadn't heard about this yet. They hadn't gone to Rome in any significant numbers at this point. God is using Paul's suffering to plant seeds in the heart of Rome, in the middle of the elite troops of the most powerful empire on earth. Anyone Paul or his friends encounter hear that this man is suffering for Jesus. Now, verse 14 is a little puzzling when you first read it, because the church has one of their main leaders in chains, right? If you think about the kinds of leaders that we respect in our church today, and you consider what it would be like if there wasn't an internet, if there wasn't a way for them to use television or to use books or to use any of the things except letters and person-to-person communication, and they locked one of the most effective people up, it would be very discouraging for most of us, right? When you see that person just taken off the battlefield, suddenly it would change everything in most people's perspective. History is filled with examples where in the middle of a battle, a great leader is taken out. And when that happens, almost always, everybody on the battlefield loses heart, right? Immediately, they start to shrink away. Many times, they just want to run because they think, if I don't have my leader, what am I going to do? I don't have anything that I should be doing here. So instead, I'm going to run and hide. We see this exactly with Jesus, right? The leader of their community is taken and arrested, and everybody runs and hides. They don't even wait until Jesus is dead. Just he gets arrested, and they say, nope, not getting in that. They run and flee. But here Paul is. He's imprisoned, and he tells us his imprisonment made everybody else more courageous. That's amazing, right? That's pretty incredible to me, because he says they are speaking the word with greater boldness and without fear because of his imprisonment. It's not incidental. It's not that they're looking at it and going, oh, okay, well, I guess we'll just soldier on. We'll just put our heads down and see if we can't make some progress. No, it says because he was thrown in prison, everybody said, hey, you know what? I'm not afraid anymore. Now, why would Paul being in prison make believers less fearful?
Down the line, he's writing letters that are spreading, so he's got the ability to, he's got time to communicate and then a means to communicate. And if he'd just been speaking or traveling before, then it might have been more isolated contacts.
Yeah.
Ultimately.
Okay. So he can maybe actually spread his message more because he is able to write letters. He has kind of restricted time. Any other thoughts? Because this is specifically in Rome that he's talking about. He's saying, the few believers that are here, they saw me get thrown into prison, and now they're less afraid. Why would that be?
I think in today's society, we kind of see that at times when an atrocious wrong has occurred and it kind of bands the community together,
Yeah.
to either support it or to find a way, to undo whatever wrong has occurred. And so I don't know if maybe that's kind of the fever that was caught.
Okay.
that
Yeah.
Because Paul was in prison, then it's like the rest of them could stand up and say, this isn't right.
Yeah.
We need to tell everybody why. We need to tell the story.
Yeah, absolutely. I think a kind of community spirit being built up. I think that this message is something that Paul's been talking about. As Jenny was talking about his letters, John in chapter 15:20, Jesus had said, remember what I told you, a servant is not greater than his master. If they persecuted me, they will persecute you also. If they obeyed my teaching, they will obey yours also. So Jesus had warned them, right? Before any of this had started happening, before even he was arrested, he said, hey, you see that I'm going to go through this great trial, so don't be surprised when this happens. And then Paul tells us in 2 Timothy 3:12, in fact, everyone who wants to live a godly life in Christ Jesus will be persecuted. Everyone who wants to live a godly life. You don't even have to live a godly life. You don't have to even make it to the point of being righteous. All you have to do is think, it would really be good if I could be righteous. And here comes the artillery. As soon as you think that thought, the enemy is going to hit you. He is going to immediately say, let's see if we can't drive that out of them. They want to be godly. I bet we can make them not want to be godly. And then 1 Thessalonians 3:3-4, Paul says, so that no one would be unsettled by these trials, for you know quite well that we are destined for them. In fact, when we were with you, we kept telling you that we would be persecuted, and it turned out that way, as you well know. So Paul says, we are all destined for this. This is part of the plan. When you are persecuted, it isn't the plan going off the rails. It is the plan right on the rails. When you're persecuted, that's what you're supposed to have. And he said, this is the moment where I can say, I told you so. This is the moment where I can say, this has been the message since the beginning. Persecution is coming. So don't be surprised by that. But the message says that suffering is worth it, right? It doesn't just say, be a Christian, be miserable. That's not the message. The message is your misery has a purpose. Your suffering is going to do something incredible that your comfort would never be able to do. The times when you would be happy, those would never accomplish what God's going to be able to accomplish through your misery. Now, there is this other group that we're going to talk about in just a moment that probably saw this as an opportunity to look at Paul and say, well, if Paul can go through that, I can. There seems to be a group of people who don't respect Paul very much. And if you read his letters pretty consistently, you'll see some people who always looked at Paul and thought, it's just Paul. As we look at him, we think, wow, Paul can do incredible things. Paul can heal people with cloths that he has prayed for. Paul can stand across a room and make a man be blind instantaneously. Paul can write most of the New Testament. And most people who heard Paul preach thought, it was okay. They weren't real excited about it. It's bizarre. When you look at the ministry of Paul, you can be encouraged if you don't have tens of thousands of people listening to you, because Paul probably never had that. Paul consistently found himself in a position where if people really liked what he was saying, it was usually because they misunderstood him. Once they really got what he was saying, they usually had a problem. And so these people who are here in Rome are going to have a problem with him, and they probably looked at him as a regular kind of human being. And they saw, well, if Paul can manage it, I bet I could manage that too. Because we will see in just a minute, there is actually a spirit in the Roman church of everyone being hyper-competitive, of everyone looking at one another and going, you know what, I think I'm a little better preacher than you. You know what, I think I could actually accomplish a little more for Jesus than you. I bet I'm going to be better at everything you could do as a Christian. And as they thought through that, they probably had this same perspective about persecution. They probably saw that Paul is going through this and they thought, I could manage twice as much prison time as Paul. You could put me in there and I could get flogged twice as often. Now, we will see that the most important reason, surely, is that the Spirit of God is active in the church, right? When God's Spirit sees his people being obedient, in spite of the circumstances, he doesn't pull back. When God sees that you are in need, he's going to be right there beside you. So when times get tough, the Spirit is going to be there much closer. You're going to have experiences with God that you would never have had except in these moments of weakness. And that's going to drive the church with a level of discipline. The gifts of the Spirit and the power of Pentecost are moving in the church. And so the whole church in Rome is fanned into flame. People would have been encouraged by God speaking directly to their churches. And when hard times come, people seek God's wisdom, right? When you're driven to your knees, when it's not something where you say, you know what, I should speak to God. When you're in this position like Paul, you're not going to think, maybe I'll talk to Jesus today. You're going to be desperate to get to your knees. You're going to be in a position where you think, I can't do anything else. Even if I don't accomplish my regular work, I have to pray right now. I have to figure out how to make more time to speak with God. And when you're in those desperate positions, God always delivers. Both outside the church and inside, Paul's suffering helps to spread the gospel. Heaven is winning. The forces of hell are arrayed against the church, and heaven is winning. But then Paul says, but wait a minute, there's some earthly struggles that were still going on. Things weren't all going as well as Paul would have hoped. If somebody could read verses 15 through 17 for us.
Some indeed preach Christ from envy and rivalry, but others from goodwill. The latter do it out of love, knowing that I am put here for the defense of the gospel. The former proclaim Christ out of rivalry, not sincerely, but thinking to afflict me in my imprisonment.
All right. Well, that's an uplifting message, isn't it, right? You've just been told the gospel is spreading. You should be excited. You should be joyful. You should be thanking God for what he's accomplishing in spite of the best plans of the enemy. And yet, right there in the middle of his celebration about joyful suffering, he brings this mess up. He says, right after he tells them that the gospel is spread more boldly and without fear, oh, by the way, there's a group of people over here, and they are all doing this with horrible motives. All of them are over here being as wicked-minded as they could be. And why would Paul bring up people with wicked, jealous motives right in the middle of this great uplifting thing? Why has he got to be a downer on this?
I think it's unnoticed. Like when Jesus was ministering, his disciples come running back immediately and say, like, hey, these guys are preaching stuff in your name. Can't we go, why don't you go smite them or something?
Yeah.
And I think it's probably not likely that these people don't notice that too.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, they already knew it was going on in Rome, right? But this is for the Philippians. So we're talking about sending a letter hundreds of miles away, and Paul says, just to let you know right up front, there's some problems going on here. Why would he tell them that? Some of them already know. What else? Okay, yeah. To get some prayer support. I think that's one good thing. I think because there's going to be some problems in Philippians that we'll be dealing with. So it's always good that you realize that you're not alone, right? I think one of the best things that God did in the New Testament is show us that the church was messy at the very start. Because so many times I hear preachers get up and say, I want us to be a New Testament church. And I think, have you read that? Because there are some parts of it that I'll sign up for, but there are some things where I go, no, please. We are a lot better than some of these New Testament churches. Some of these guys were doing things that I think, man, how would you continue to lead in a place like that? How could you do anything except say, I'm going down the road and starting over? Church split or not, this isn't happening. But here Paul is telling them, this is the authentic life of the Christian, right? This is what life with Jesus is like. So many times, we have a picturesque idea, and we think life with Jesus is going to be up here, and we're all going to just need to find those people. So if we just get to a church where there's enough of those people that are up here, we can all be up there together, and all the people in this other church are not going to give us any trouble. And wouldn't you know it, every time you think you found one of those, there's some of those people that stay down here the whole time. And you think, man, I'm going to have to go down the road because I got to find another church, because eventually I'll find the one where everybody stays up there with Jesus the whole time. And what Paul is telling us in Philippians is that isn't going to happen. Every church has the rabble-rousers. Every church has the difficult people. Every church has those where you go, God, couldn't we just send them down to Abba's house for a little bit? I mean, it would really just help us out if we just had a little less of that. Because they're so big over there, they wouldn't even notice. If you're doing your very best, if you're trying to follow Jesus the way that Paul is, right in the midst of that, when you have seen that there is glory in suffering, that the risen Lord is coming, that he is going to accomplish everything that he promised he would, there's going to be somebody that walks up right beside you, lovingly smiles at you, pats you on the shoulder, and stabs you right in the back. And when they do that, most times we're shocked. And we go, how could that have happened? Because there's little that's more painful than human betrayal, right? When somebody that we trust does something that is painful to us, that's extremely hurtful. Much more than the actual pain, the betrayal stacks on top of it. And one of the most difficult parts is that we've just been told in verse 14, these are not fake Christians. These are not outsiders. These are brothers and sisters. Brothers and sisters, members of the family of God, are trying to stab Paul. That is horrible. None of us want that message because we want to see those people and think, they're awful people. We're not dealing with them. And God says, no, they're your brothers and sisters. And it's almost unbelievable, unless you've been a Christian for a while, right? If you've been a Christian for a while, you've had this experience. You know that there are some people who you will be stunned will stab you. And yet they will. Paul says there are two different groups of Christians in Rome. He says one is righteous, trying to be loving and kind, focused entirely on Jesus. All of them are doing exactly the right thing for the right reason. They surely helped Paul remember he wasn't alone. He was allowed visitors while he was in prison. So these people are probably coming by and saying, hey, Paul, we're praying for you. We're really trying to make sure that we can do anything we can to help you out. But the other group, Paul tells us, they're preaching because of envy and rivalry. Can you imagine that? That you go to the trouble of preaching. Because these are not people who would have been able to make a jet plane's worth of money. This isn't a situation where you could have become internationally known for being a preacher in Rome. You would have been a nobody among nobodies, and these people say, I'm going to be the chief nobody. You just watch out. Everybody in this tiny little group, they're going to know my name. And they're not even going to care about Paul anymore because they're less interested in building the kingdom than they are building themselves. We've all seen people like this on TV or online where we have suspicions about their motives. We look at them and we think, yeah, but do they really care about Jesus? I mean, what they say sounds good, but are they doing that for the right reason? Are they really committed to God? Or is this just a way for them to earn a living? Or maybe to make their name bigger? There are people who preach Jesus, but they seem arrogant about it. When it seems like somebody just wants to be known, when they just want to be seen, when they just want everybody else to talk about them, kind of makes us sick, right? Because if you're a true Christian, you want all of that glory to go to Jesus. So when you hear somebody who says, hey, but wait, make sure that you give me credit. You can use that illustration from my sermon, but let everybody know that it was me that came up with it. Because I'm the one who really needs the credit for this. Now we know that Paul was the extreme opposite of this behavior. He called himself the worst of sinners, the least of the apostles, and unworthy to be called an apostle. He insists he never looked for praise among humans. And as we were just discussing, I think that's true to Paul's ministry. If you look at it again and again, we are told Paul didn't care. He just wants Jesus preached. And so he is interested in only bringing worship to God. He isn't interested in competing to be the most famous or the richest. But these people aren't just trying to puff themselves up. That would have been distracting and annoying enough. You're in prison and you hear, hey, you know what? That preacher out here, he's telling us that he's better than you. Okay, good for him. Doesn't bother me. Paul is never really naive because he sees that their secondary motive is to increase his suffering. They see this man in prison and they think, you know what? He could really use another little kick in the ribs. That would really help him out. As Gandhi is supposed to have said, I like their Christ, but I don't like the Christians, right? We've all met some of those where you think, why do you even call yourself that? Why do you use that name if you're going to act like this? All of us know what it's like to encounter Christians that seem so unlike Christ. And one of the easiest reactions is to simply try to reject them as believers. We can look at them and we can say, hey, Bible says you shall know them by their fruit. Well, I don't see any fruit, so you're not a Christian, you're out. Not even got anything to do with you. Push you as far away as I can. But what we find in the Bible is that Paul calls them brothers and sisters. These people who have very small fruit. These people who seem to be doing very little for the right reason. God doesn't hide the reality from us. He wrote down the selfishness and the meanness. And there are times when true Christians want to truly hurt you. That's really hard to really face because we can't understand it. We think everybody who loves Jesus should love those who love Jesus, right? It makes sense. That's what the Bible tells us. What should our response be to those who preach Jesus with bad motives? Okay. Don't let them get you down. Love, grace, yeah. I think those are great answers. I think Paul's answer is one of those answers like in James where you go, don't say that. I mean, I could deal with consider it all joy and think about it as if it's not really a big deal and pray for them and hope not to have coals of fire just all over the top of their heads. But Paul says something different. If somebody could please read verse 18 for us.
What does it matter? Just this, that Christ is proclaimed in every way, whether out of false motives or true, and in that I rejoice. Yes, and I will continue to rejoice.
Oof. That's one of those verses that punches me right in the gut. I'm reading along, and Paul says, these people are terrible. They are trying to do everything for bad reasons. They're trying to hurt me. Sounds like they're trying to tear down the church. And Paul says, but they're brothers and sisters, and they're preaching Jesus. And so because of those two things, I'm going to rejoice. Whew. I could tolerate them maybe, but rejoice? I'm going to look at these people who want me to suffer. I'm chained to this guy 24 hours a day. I'm under sentence of death. I have no money. I have no acclaim. I have nothing that's positive except Jesus Christ in my life. And I'm going to rejoice. Whew. Now, this response covers our first group, right? Those people who you see on TV who you go, all right, they're preaching, but I can just tell that they're doing it for the wrong reason. I can just tell that they're motivated in this wrong way, and everything that they're doing is really trying to enrich themselves. But be careful, because if they're preaching Jesus, rejoice. Now, I'm not saying anything else. If they're preaching something else, that's different. But if they're preaching Jesus, and you can tell in your estimation that they're doing it for the wrong reason, you should rejoice. That's a difficult thing to do. That's only going to come about in prayer. You're not going to be able to will yourself to that. You're not going to be able to look at that and see these people who are greedy for fame and money and influence and think, all right, I'm going to rejoice for them. But once you see that God can use their message, even if he despises their motives, it can shift everything. But it also covers the situation that Paul finds himself in, where he's not detached, right? He's not just looking at them at a distance and saying, okay, yeah, they're over there in this city, and I've heard that they have 3 pools and they have 10 servants and they eat 6 meals a day. That's a little galling. But Paul knows they're doing it in part so that he is in pain. Can you imagine that? Somebody preaching so that you suffer. That's a weird concept. I can't imagine what kind of sermon I would put together to think of another preacher and think, that's really going to stick in their craw. They're really going to have a miserable time because I preached that. That's just bizarre. And yet what seems happens is these people are figuring out ways to make sure that their message gets back to Paul. Now, most scholars think that what's happening here is that there's a dispute where Paul comes in with the true gospel of Jesus Christ, and these people have the true gospel of Jesus, but they want their version. It's kind of like when somebody wants to found a new denomination on the basis of the color of the pews. And they say, all right, I got the real truth. You got to have purple pews. If you don't have purple pews, you're not really a Christian. We don't know what this dispute actually was. But it seems as if what they're doing is going around Rome and saying, see, if we were wrong, we'd be in jail. But God put him in jail because we got the truth. So you should follow us. And make sure Paul finds out that he was wrong the whole time. We knew it. And God's showing it to him. But Paul says he's going to celebrate their preaching. When the news gets back to him that they're doing it for this horrible reason, he says, all right, way to go, Jesus. I'm so excited that the kingdom is expanding. And he doesn't care about that other stuff. Now, it's important that he wrote it down because that's an example for us, right? Paul isn't being passive-aggressive here and writing it down and saying, man, that really bothers me, but I'm going to have that in the Word of God for all time, that you did it for the wrong reason. No. He's saying, I want you to know that I understood it was for the wrong reason, because that's the example. If it's the worst case, if you are in a position where you can't imagine things getting worse, and then the people who are supposed to love you, who are supposed to help you, they come along and try to make it worse. If they're doing that by preaching Jesus, you should celebrate. If they have figured out a way to try to make you suffer by preaching Jesus, celebrate. That's a very difficult thing. In the next chapter, Paul is going to encourage us to live in a way that's completely different from our flesh and world. And so he wants to make it clear, hey, if I can do this, I'm just Paul. You guys can do this. You can see what's going on here. You can understand that this is about as bad as it gets. I'm on death row. I know that at any time, they can come and say, hey, emperor's ready to hear your appeal. In a Roman trial, that was probably about a 10-minute court. It's about all you got. The emperor is probably not actually presiding directly over it because it would have to be a good enough argument that someone would say, hey, whoa, let's call Nero in here. Let's let him hear this. So Paul's probably talking to some underling at some point in the future, and he's going to say, hey, this is why I shouldn't be put to death. He would have been very familiar with this. And so at any moment, it could be time. You could have your life over. And here Paul is celebrating in prison because the gospel is spreading. The people who should have loved him wanted to hurt him. They didn't just ignore him, they loathed him. They're trying to twist the knife. Now, if I think somebody was rude to me last Sunday, I don't really have a lot of reason to complain, right? It's not that that doesn't matter. It's that if they're working for the gospel, I should celebrate for them being there. I should be thankful that they are a part of the church, even if they're not always what they should be to me. Because we're humans, because we're difficult for one another, because we're going to have all kinds of points of friction where things rub up against one another and we really get hurt. It doesn't mean the pain isn't real. It means that the pain is worth it. It means that you should be willing to work through that and say, thank you, Jesus, that that person is pushing forward the gospel. Paul wants us to follow his example. Rejoice at what they're doing, even if you can't rejoice at why they're doing it. That's tough. Now, I want to be careful here. Paul never rejoiced or even tolerated those who were not preaching the true gospel. If there's somebody that's spreading some kind of message that isn't the real truth of Jesus, Paul was one of the harshest people that you can imagine. I've got a slide here where Paul goes through just a few of his verses here, where if they attacked Paul but preached Jesus, Paul rejoices. But if they attack the church, Paul attacks them. He is very ready. He, in fact, at one point says, people that are coming in here with a false doctrine are servants of the devil. And they're going to get exactly what the devil's going to get. So Paul's not confused. He's not saying these people over here in Rome, they mean well, but they're saying whatever they want to. That isn't the standard. You have to be an authentic Christian, a true brother or sister, as Paul says in Philippians. And then, if you are a true brother or sister and you are preaching the truth of Jesus, Paul doesn't care why you're preaching it. Even if you have bad motives, if you've got the message right, he's going to celebrate. If a person decides to proclaim Jesus out of bad motives, rejoice. We're required to protect the doctrines and purity of the church. There can be no compromise. There can be no point where we can say, this person probably means well. That's kind of the whole point Paul is making. Intentions aren't enough. The content is what counts. Every truthful proclamation of Jesus is worthy of celebration. Paul sees the bigger picture. He can see the kingdom benefit. He has his eyes on Jesus. I'll again quote Hebrews 12, as we did a couple of weeks ago, but for a different purpose tonight. Let us fix our eyes on Jesus, the author and perfecter of our faith, who for the joy set before him endured the cross, scorning its shame, and sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. Consider him who endured such hostility from sinners, so that you will not grow weary and lose heart. What Paul is saying is, when you're in this position where everything is going horrible, where you can't imagine it getting worse, and then a Christian tries to make it worse, look at Jesus and remember his disciples. Remember that experience that he had, where the very people that he hand-selected and said, you are the foundation of my church. You are the ones who will start everything, and I will trust you with teaching that no one else is going to get. Those people all betray. And one of them tries to hurt him. And Paul is saying, if they are doing the right thing, celebrate. Someone might preach the gospel, hoping to get rich, or hoping to be famous, or hoping to hurt the feelings of someone else, but all of them are still preaching the truth. And the Lord wants you to keep your eyes on the kingdom at all times. When you start thinking about you, or you start thinking about your local church or your local church people, you're going to get off balance really quick. You're going to start thinking about personalities. You're going to start thinking about how you feel about other people. And Paul says, no, stay on the kingdom. It's normal and expected for you to want your suffering to be reduced, right? The Bible tells you, ask God when you're in these bad positions. You should be praying for God to reduce your suffering. But there should also be times in your life where suffering is going to come. We just said in 2 Timothy 3:12, God promised us suffering if we just want to live a godly life. If you never suffer for Jesus, I wonder, what's the deal, right? He says all you have to do is want to live a godly life, and persecution is going to come. So if you can look at your life and think, I don't really ever suffered. Do you want to live a godly life? God's given you a promise. If you pursue His things, persecution is going to come. Persecution is a kind of litmus test for us. You should have suffering for Jesus if you are living for Jesus. But times may come when the suffering seems beyond what you could take. Paul has every possession taken. He's old, probably. He's at this point of a death sentence. He's in chains, and these believers want to hurt him. And in those times, it's easy to do nothing but think about other people, right? To consider, why aren't they suffering? How come I'm the only one that's having to deal with this? There's all these Christians out here. I'm even hearing about some of them preaching for the wrong reason. How come they're not in the cell beside me? What are you doing, God? This isn't fair. But if you worry about that, you're going to be completely off kilter, because your focus the whole time should be the kingdom. You shouldn't be looking at other people and trying to decide what's fair. You should be trying to celebrate whatever is preaching the kingdom. Thank God for who these people are and what they're doing. Be especially thankful for those who are doing the right thing for the right reason, right? That's what Paul says when he says, some of these know why I'm here, and they're doing it out of love. They see this and they go, we got to get out there and preach this message. Don't you see what Paul's going through? If you have some of those people, be especially grateful for them. But be grateful for everyone who preaches Christ. Don't let your crisis get your focus off your Christ. In Mark 9:38 through 41, the reference that Jenny gave us earlier, John comes to Jesus and he sees this crowd and he says, "Teacher, we saw someone casting out demons in your name, and we tried to stop him because he was not following us. But Jesus said, 'Do not stop him. For no one who does a deed of power in my name will soon be able afterward to speak evil of me. Whoever is not against us is for us. For truly I tell you, whoever gives you a cup of water to drink because you bear the name of Christ will by no means lose the reward.'" Jesus says, everyone who is not against us is for us. That's a standard that very few Christians want to apply. Denominationalism is wonderful in trying to get the doctrines right, but it is a poison of Satan because it divides the church again and again and again. And all you have to do is pull out a chart of the denominations through history. If you look up on the internet how the denominations have split from the wonderful Reformation that was an absolute necessary move of the Spirit, the days of the Pentecostal revival that were wonderful moves of the Spirit. But as you look at that, people split off because they were trying to follow the legitimate doctrines of God. And then very shortly after, the enemy steps in and says, "Oh yeah? Well, if that's right, how about this? Let's split off of that, and let's split off of that, and let's split off of that." And we have thousands of little groups. And each of us is absolutely convinced we have the exact perfect interpretation of Jesus' word. And God's sitting up there going, what in the world are you guys doing? How can you decide that the thing that matters most is this little bit, to where you won't share resources, you won't pray with one another, you won't meet with one another? You've decided they're a different religion when they preach the truth of Jesus Christ. If they preach Jesus Christ, celebrate that they are preaching Him. If they preach anything false, absolutely condemn them. But if they are celebrated, they will celebrate us, and we will work together, and we will unite the church and forget so much of the schism, so much of the division, so much of the belief that we have perfection when no one is ever going to be able to figure all of these things out. If the kingdom of God is advanced by wrong motives, it's not for us to judge. The Bible tells us that all of creation is in a war between light and darkness, right? In a war, you don't really care too much about the motives of your soldiers. If you go back and study history, at the beginning of a war, when a war gets really serious, everybody starts saying, the true patriot is the volunteer. And you'll have people who will say, the people who are really going to be celebrated are those who sign up for the first days. And as the war progresses, as things get tougher, as the difficulty increases, as casualties happen, nobody cares. Once the war is over, nobody's looking it up. Nobody goes back to the casualty table and says, wait a minute, this person enlisted on the first day of the war. They don't care. What they care about is that you have a soldier. Because when the war gets tough, all you want is more soldiers. The war is getting tough. The war against darkness is getting worse and worse and worse. And it's bizarre to me how many of us look at the soldiers around us and we say, wait a minute, they don't really have the motive. They're really not doing it for the right reason. Put that away. Focus on the kingdom. If you see the importance of the war, you understand that battles with eternal consequences are being fought all around you. And so you should celebrate every victory. You shouldn't be worried about it. The cause of Christ is worth it. If you embrace the value of the victory, you can have the life of joy. Even when the people around you, even your brothers and sisters in Christ, are trying to make you miserable, because you can focus on the kingdom. Now, next week we'll see that Paul will continue to explain his perspective and tell the Philippians and us that we should follow his example. Who will close us out in prayer?